I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you our 36th episode, and possibly one of our most generally relevant episodes to absolutely everybody that we've done yet. This episode is going to be about sleep, something that we all do for hopefully a significant portion of every single day. And we're going to be hearing from one of the foremost experts on sleep and how to do it correctly, Dr. Christopher Winter at the Charlottesville Neurology and Sleep Medicine Center. We've also got winners from our last 3 bottles going out of Green Tea Focus. If you happen to be any of the 3 following people, Annie Gruel, Hugo Viljoen, or Kazra Eminian, these are going to be coming to you in the mail, I guess, directly. We'll be getting in touch with you on email and sending those out. As for the rest of you, you are on your own for your neurostimulants. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you about a part of your brain that apparently will help you with your craving control, which is really important given how much of the things that we can do to, adversely impact our own lives are just basically us not dealing with cravings where we should know better. So maybe this is something where slapping on a transcranial direct current stimulator in just the right spot can help make a difference. Anyway, we'll get to that, but first let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So I saw an interesting article recently that was like the average age of people in different countries over the world. Obviously, different countries have much different average population ages from all sorts of factors. And Japan is a really interesting country, obviously, for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it is an old population. The average age in Japan was the highest in the world, and it was something like 47, 48 years old, which was dramatically old. When you think about it, that's early grandparenthood for a lot of people. But anyway, so one of the big problems for Japan looming on the horizon is Alzheimer's disease. In Japan, the burden of Alzheimer's disease by the year 2050 is estimated to be at $500 billion US, which is a figure currently equivalent to the government's entire annual revenues. So not a pretty picture, and there's a lot of effort going on both in Japan and around the world to try to find ways to combat, alleviate, prevent Alzheimer's disease. There was a lot of progress on this in the early 1990s, but since then the pace of discovery has slowed. They've been doing a lot of work with animal models, mouse models in particular, but it seems like one of the sort of bottlenecks in new discoveries has been that the mouse models of Alzheimer's are not quite accurate. What they've been doing for a long time is using mice that have been genetically altered to overproduce a protein called amyloid precursor protein, APP. But there's some problems in that the overaccumulation of this protein has some effects in mice that it doesn't tend to have in humans, and so it's not a perfect match. But recently, a team of researchers led by Takeomi Saito of the Riken Brain Science Institute in Japan has reported the creation of 2 new mouse models of Alzheimer's disease that could improve on the current model and give people a dramatically better way of studying the progression of Alzheimer's in these animal models. This article deals mainly with protein names and things like that that probably aren't really appropriate for me to try to pronounce, much less try to explain. But the idea that we've got what seems to be a substantial uptick in our ability to study Alzheimer's seems like pretty good news for everybody.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I've been wanting to do a sleep episode for a darn long time, partially because I feel like sleep is one of my weak points. It's one of the things I don't do particularly well. I fall asleep really easily, but I feel like I do not sleep enough, and I definitely do not keep a consistent sleep schedule. Sometimes I sort of yo-yo from being a real night owl to a complete early bird and cut my sleep short for several nights in a row and then sort of binge sleep and go for like 11 or 12 hours one of the weekend days or something like that. So I'm all over the map with this, and that's something that I know I should probably improve on. But part of me has been like, well, until I have all the information on sleep, there's no point in like fine-tuning something if I'm not sure if I'm fine-tuning in the right direction. So I've probably been delaying some of my own sleep optimization for a conversation like this one that you're about to listen to. So I was very excited to have Dr. Christopher Winter on the show. He's one of those guys who you frequently see interviewed when talking about sleep. This is his area of specialty, and he's got a lot to say about the subject. We're going to jump right in here, something that applies to absolutely everybody: sleep.
I mean, there are some individuals who don't need that much sleep and some who need more. The first consideration is often, well, are you sleeping more to compensate for poor quality sleep, which is always something to kind of look out for. But if that's not the case, I would say the range is somewhere between 6 to 9 or maybe 6 to 10 hours if you're sort of plotting out a bell curve, with the average individual who sleeps normally getting somewhere around 7.5 to maybe 8.
Do we know anything about physiologically what the differences are between the people that might be on the high end and the low end of that bell curve? What accounts for some people needing more or less, or is that still sort of a mystery at this point?
I think it's probably still a mystery. I mean, there are definitely genes that sort of control. When you think about the two different factors of sleep, there's how much do you need and when do you prefer to get it, and there are definite genetic factors that have been worked out for both of those characteristics. So, why it is that some people need more than others, I don't think it's really been worked out. But I always feel like sleep follows a lot of patterns that eating follows, and some people need to eat more to keep their metabolic flame going, and other people need to eat less, and I think sleep's probably no different.
Right. What about polyphasic sleeping? There's a lot of productivity hackers in this crowd, and I think polyphasic sleeping is something that kind of comes to our attention every now and then when you're reading about things people do on the internet to try to squeeze a little bit more productivity out of their days. What are your thoughts on biphasic and maybe like the Uberman sleep schedule is something that gets bandied about sometimes?
Yeah, I think the Uberman sleep schedule is bunk. I would love to see somebody actually prove to me that they're doing it and actually thriving. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And Grant Stoddard wrote a great article about that in Men's Health several years ago. And it doesn't make any physiological sense. It's basically like a diet where you stand out in front of the sun and photosynthesize your own food. It just doesn't really add up. As you start to break up sleep, I think that it's like a concert. If you went to a concert and the band started playing and every 20 minutes they stopped for 10 and took a break, I think you'd be pretty frustrated even if the band played the whole concert. That's the way sleep is. Sleep needs to come in continuous blocks. So a biphasic sleep pattern, there's Eric, the professor down at Virginia Tech, wrote a great sort of history about sleep, and that makes sense to me. Maybe some people wake up and have difficulty staying asleep throughout the entire night, but I think when you start going into 3, 4, 5 blocks of sleep during a 24-hour period, you're just not getting from it what other people get. And every medical student, every resident is a biphasic sleeper. Let me tell you, it's the worst I've ever felt my entire life, and I don't need that much sleep.
Yeah, that's great to know. When people are able to pull off biphasic sleep, is it typically, are they getting a full 90-minute sleep cycle within their sort of long extended nap?
I guess that depends on how you divide. How your biphasic sleep is divided. Is it one big block at night, and then you take a 20-minute nap during the day, or you sneak out to your car and get some sleep, or do you actually go to bed at 8 o'clock, wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and play Titanfall for 4 hours, and then go back to bed and wake up and go to work? There's lots of ways to sort of divide it. So I guess that depends on the individual.
Yeah. I guess the people that I know that have tried the biphasic and stuck with it seem like they kind of do it siesta style. Like there's a significantly long nap after lunchtime, but I guess there's a lot of ways to skin that cat.
And I think that in some ways that schedule makes sense. We have a sort of a natural lull in our wakefulness shortly after lunchtime. It's sort of, our brain has built up enough adenosine to feel sleepy, but our circadian rhythm sort of hasn't swept in and rescued us at that point. So when you look at that little divot that those two graphs, when you overlap them, create, it would seem that that's sort of a natural time for us to sleep. So I think that cultures or individuals that utilize that nap, I can't really find fault with that. I think it can be a very refreshing sort of thing and kind of boost you for the second half of your day.
Mm-hmm. If you find yourself in a situation where you've got to cut back on sleep for a couple of nights, people say different things about whether you can sort of catch up on sleep, whether if you accumulate a sleep debt, whether you can actually pay it off, or if you're really kind of screwing yourself. What's your thoughts on that?
I think you can. I think that the sleep that I lost in residency is gone forever, but I think that if I stay up late tonight to do a project, I think I can definitely sleep in tomorrow or maybe even the next day and make it up. So the real question to me is, when is the sleep debt unpayable?
Yeah.
So if I wait 4 days, 5 days, 2 weeks, at one point, can I not really make up for the lost sleep? So I certainly think you can. In the short period. So, when people ask me how best to go about that, I think the best thing for people to do is, go to bed late, try to wake up at or around the same time you normally wake up. You know, get a little something to eat, expose your brain to some light, walk the dog, and then at some point go back to sleep to sort of subsidize what you've lost. Well, doing that, you can still sort of keep your circadian rhythm in order, where you're not, sleeping in until noon, walking out of your dark bedroom, eating lunch, your brain thinks it's breakfast. I think those kinds of situations can make things kind of difficult for people, especially if they're in the situation frequently.
Yeah. So stages of sleep. There's sort of the famous 5 stages of sleep, I guess, stages 1 through 4, and then REM, where you get your dreams in. Which of those are the ones that are most important for optimal cognition?
So the stages of sleep now, they've actually done away with that classification.
Okay, I'm behind
it's
the
still
times.
The same. Sleep hasn't changed. We just classify it differently. So stages 3 and 4, which were both considered deep sleep, are now just considered stage N3, N as in Nancy. And the only difference between the two stages in the past were basically how much deep sleep was occupied, or slow wave sleep was occupied in a 30-second period. So right now it's much simpler. There's wakefulness, light sleep, deep sleep, dream sleep, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of cognition, I would say that deep sleep is going to be the most important thing for cognition, simply because deep sleep or slow wave sleep is what really makes you awake. So, I think that, deep sleep is typically, lack thereof is what makes you sleepy or seek sleep. It's when growth hormone is secreted. There's a lot of positive things about deep sleep. It typically happens during the first half of our night. So it's basically the motor that makes us go. REM sleep is traditionally what's thought to be much more cognitively based. It's very important for memory. It's important for mood, focus. It may be important in terms of the way an individual perceives pain. I think that, the test question, which is more important for cognition, is probably REM sleep or dream sleep. But, in my opinion, if you can't wake up and get out of bed, it doesn't really matter how well your brain's thinking if you're asleep. So, they're both important. They do two different things, though.
What about people that are traveling and dealing with jet lag? Any particular tips for that?
Yeah, jet lag, first of all, there's some wonderful medications for jet lag that are actually FDA approved now. They're FDA approved for shift work disorder, but for anybody who travels in relationship to their work, they can be great. Modafinil or armodafinil are just outstanding drugs for shift work. If you're doing things non-medically, one sort of interesting thing for people to do is fasting. Cliff Saper did some research up at Harvard looking at what fasting does to the circadian rhythm, which is what's getting disrupted in jet lag, and showed that basically if you fasted, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is sort of in charge of our circadian rhythm, is sort of rendered dormant, and our paraventricular nucleus sort of takes over. And basically the thought is, if an organism is starving, it doesn't make a lot of sense for it to go to sleep.
Right.
Like, it really needs to find food first, then it can sleep. So the way you can sort of practically utilize that is if you're traveling, to not eat, and drink a little water on the plane, but stay away from the Hudson newsstand in the airport and all the wonderful goodies there, and not eat. And when you arrive in Paris, France, that's when you want to eat with the next meal that happens while you're there. And so what happens is, during the fasting period, your suprachiasmatic nucleus suspends the circadian rhythm. And once food is found, it reestablishes the rhythm with that time.
Huh.
So it can be really, really helpful. And then, we make a bunch of cards for the team. We work with a lot of professional sports teams, and, for scouts and people like that who are really traveling and suffering some significant jet lag. We've got little charts and cards they can keep with their overnight bag that basically says, when should you seek light? When should you seek dark? When should you exercise? When should you eat? When should you eat protein-rich foods? When should you go heavy on carbs? and we can use those things to, both before they travel and after, to sort of help them adjust quickly. Or if you're saying, look, I'm flying to this place, I've got one meeting, then I'm coming right back, we may not want to help the individual. We may want to help the individual pretend like they never even arrived in that time zone.
Right.
We did that with the sports team recently, where they had to play exhibition games in Europe and Asia, and frankly, the team didn't care about them. They said, look, we just want to get there, play these games, fulfill our obligation, and get back and get on with the season with our athletes not being exhausted from the trip. So that's exactly what we did. We sort of created a situation where the athletes' brains never really felt like they moved. Of course, it meant sequestering them in their hotel at certain times. It made them, getting up in the middle of the night and going to do things in a hotel ballroom. So weird meal timing, but you can do it. It's just how much do you want to invest in it?
That's really interesting. So tell me a little about what happens when you are cut back from sleep for a significant amount of time. They talk about, one of the most, I guess, effective means of torturing somebody, short of beating them with a stick, is just sleep deprivation, that people, turn into just total space cadets within the period of about 36 hours. What's really going on there within our brain when we do start getting into severe sleep deprivation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on. It's an incredibly stressful situation. So anytime stress is involved with the body, there's massive cortisol shifts and changes. And when cortisol starts changing your body, insulin and carb levels are sort of soon to follow. So right away, individuals start to show changes in terms of their heart rate. Blood pressure problems are always constant for people who are constantly sleep deprived. Then you start to see changes in metabolically, where the brain is basically saying, look, if I can't get energy and feel better from sleeping, what the body starts to do is it starts trying to, in my opinion, eat itself awake. So, a chemical in your body called ghrelin, which makes you crave a bunch of crap that you'd find at a gas station convenience store, it surges. It's a chemical found in your gut. And then leptin, which is a chemical found in adipose tissues, which makes you feel full, it decreases. So you got this terrible storm of wanting to buy the Chips Ahoy cookies and the barbecue potato chips, but at the same time, one bag's not enough. You got to get 2 and 3. So, weight changes often go along, and now you start getting into the metabolic, syndrome, where it's difficult to tell what started it and what's causing things. But that's one of the great things about patients who are overweight, who are diabetic, or who have high blood pressure. Treating sleep problems, either of their own making or something that's intrinsically causing poor sleep quality, often makes these individuals much healthier.
Interesting. What can people do if they feel like they're not getting quality sleep?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that the first thing people should do is really sort of try to get a sense of how sleepy they are. I mean, I've got patients who come to see me on a daily basis that'll tell me they're only getting 1 or 2 hours of sleep a night.
Whoa. Which
sort of speaks to the whole idea of, an individual, particularly when they start getting very anxious about their sleep, they start to sort of misperceive it. Mm-hmm. So, and that's one place where a device like I wear a Basis band, which is sort of tracks your sleep. That's one place where something like that can be very helpful, where an individual says, look, I'm only getting 1 or 2 hours of sleep a night, despite what their spouse is telling them. Wearing something like that, when you wake up and you look at it, like, wow, I got 6 hours and 38 minutes of sleep. It really felt like I only got 2 hours of sleep. So there's often this sense that patients are misperceiving what they're actually sleeping. And that tends to go along with that sort of anxious sort of characteristic, personality type. So those individuals who are breaking down my door to get an appointment, who are not sleeping, oh my God, you got to have, it's like Michael Jackson. When you actually look at their level of sleepiness during the day, it's not particularly high. So one thing your listeners could do is you just go to Google and type in Epworth sleepiness scale. And so basically it's 8 situations that an individual might find themselves in, and you rate how likely would it be for you to fall asleep in that situation. And if your score is like 8 or 9 or above, it's 15, 20, then those indicate that you're excessively sleepy. So you ask yourself the question, are you getting enough sleep? And if the patient says, look, I'm getting tons of sleep. I go to bed every night at 10 o'clock and get up at 7. I mean, I'm getting, 10 hours of sleep at night, but I still feel incredibly sleepy. Then that's where you want to really start focusing on a sleep quality problem.
Mm-hmm.
Sleepiness only comes about through lack of sleep quantity or lack of sleep quality.
Right. How often do you find that, people talk about, oh, I ate something weird during dinner. I had, Brussels sprouts with wine or something like that, and then that affects the quality of their sleep. How true is that? Is that a wives' tale, or can the food that you eat, especially for dinner, really have a major effect on sleep quality?
Oh, I think that it can. I mean, I think that, and probably in a lot of ways. I mean, we see a lot of reflux in patients sometimes. So if you're eating something that causes you to have heartburn or acid reflux, that can definitely be, an effect, something that affects your sleep. Coffee, tea, chocolate, all of those things can be hard on your sleep as well too. If we have had patients who've described having restless leg syndrome, and it gets worse when they have certain foods at night. We typically think of proteins as being sort of more stimulating because they get shunted more towards dopamine, whereas carbohydrate, thinking about your Thanksgiving meal tends to be more sedating. So I think that foods can play a big role in sleep. I mean, we do occasionally have. The thing about it is that sleep's like the stock market. I mean, it's natural to have ups and downs. So I think some people can drive themselves crazy. And I'm a neurologist, and people do the same thing with their headaches. They go and out to eat and have some shrimp, and they have a terrible headache the next day. And like, oh my God, but what if it was the shrimp? I'm never going to eat shrimp again. And they go for several months without having a headache, and they're convinced it was a shrimp, but then all of a sudden they have a headache again. So I think to some extent you can drive yourself a little bit crazy, but sleep is definitely affected by what we consume at night. Alcohol is a terrible one.
You want to riff on that for a second? Sounds like you've got more to say.
Oh no, sure. I mean, I think that alcohol, I think, is the number one sleep aid in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it does nothing positive for sleep besides sedate. So. And I tell people all the time, if you're getting in bed at 10 o'clock and it takes you an hour and a half to fall asleep, then go to bed at 11:30. As long as you're not changing your wake-up time, people get really worked up about their sleep. So, one of the first patients I saw in the practice I'm in right now was a guy who came in because his wife forced him to, because he was drinking wine to the point where he would fall asleep every night, but he would fall asleep with the wine in his hand and spill all over himself. So he got tired of doing the laundry. So, anybody who's using something to fall asleep on a regular basis, you really should kind of look at that, and especially alcohol, because alcohol tends to, affect REM sleep negatively. It tends to diminish deep sleep. It tends to increase breathing disturbances. I mean, there's just nothing positive about alcohol. So I always tell my patients, have all the alcohol you want, just have it with breakfast.
As long as you don't have a 9-to-5 job, maybe.
That's right. I'm a sleep doctor. I'm not worried about anything else, right?
Right.
I see life through a bubble.
No, that's fair. Let's. One thing I want to circle back to. You mentioned that alcohol will put you to sleep, but it'll sedate you, and I guess sort of drawing the distinction there. That was something that one of the doctors we had on an earlier episode mentioned, is that most of the sleep aids, so-called sleep aids on the market, will render you unconscious, but they're not necessarily going to be beneficial, and they might have adverse effects on the actual stages of sleep and the restfulness that you'll get out of your sleep, despite the fact you'll be unconscious. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, clonazepam, or the sort of a kind of a Valium-like drug, which is sort of a mainstay for sleep in the past. I mean, they don't do anything positive for your sleep. In fact, it typically, results in a very light, fitful sleep, even though the patient is unconscious. You look at Ambien and all the problems that drug has with people getting up and doing weird things in the night and having no memory of doing it the next day. I mean, when people want quality sleep, there's really not a drug that's going to be used for that. I mean, your body does a pretty good job of that by itself. So, I just don't think that those types of medications are at all helpful for sleep. And I think that our country sort of has it wrong. I mean, the use of sedating drugs or sleepers or hypnotics is just incredible. And I feel like I spend all my time trying to help people get off of the medications. It's like being hooked on your baby blanket. I mean, they're not really doing anything for you, but people just freak out when they think about not being able to use them.
Right, right. You mentioned both modafinil and armodafinil earlier, which is something that a lot of listeners of this show have experience with, and generally some pretty positive experience. I use modafinil myself probably about twice on any given week, just when I want to get some extra work done. And I always try to take it really early in the day because it has such a long half-life. Even if you're taking it, at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., it's still going to be kind of in your system by the time your normal bedtime would roll around. Are the upsides, you think, to cognition during the day worth the downside of some diminished sleep that night, or do you have to make that choice on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of I don't think there's a lot of downside to either of those drugs. And I'll just disclose that I have been a speaker for both Provigil and Nuvigil. But I'm a speaker simply because I feel so strongly about the drug. The nice thing about those drugs in relationship to the older stimulants, we consider these drugs, armodafinil, more wakefulness-promoting drugs, is that they really shouldn't affect your ability to fall asleep when you volitionally want to. What I tell my patients, the medication just gives you more control over the situation. In fact, we've used these drugs to help people who can't wake up in the morning by giving it to them before they go to bed, as strange as that sounds. But that's really where the distinction between these drugs and a drug like Adderall or Ritalin comes, is that when you give somebody Adderall, it can help them definitely maintain wakefulness, but it can often make it very difficult for that person to initiate sleep when they want to. And that's a big thing to kind of wrap your mind around, is that the idea that what keeps us awake or what's in charge of vigilance in our brain is not necessarily what's causing us to initiate and maintain sleep. There's sort of two different things, and a lot of people still think about sleep as being a light switch. Well, when the mechanism's on, you're awake, and when you turn it off, you're asleep. But it's really two different mechanisms. It's really wakefulness is when vigilance is on and the sleep mechanism is off, or sleep is when the sleep mechanism is on and vigilance is off, and you can see elements of the two different variables in individuals who sleepwalk, or have cataplexy, where you've got, or sleep paralysis, where you've got consciousness but lingering paralysis from something like REM sleep. So when you start looking at it as two different variables, sleep makes the strange, interesting things about sleep make more sense. And so modafinil or armodafinil does a really good job of promoting vigilance without impairing sleep. So I think it's a great drug. It's a drug that when you wake up and take it, you can feel good. But if you wake up and feel great in the morning and think about lunchtime, oh God, I really should have taken that drug, I don't think you're going to really jeopardize your sleep that night. I had used it one time on a long car ride to Florida, and about halfway into the ride, I said, I'm going to take this medication. I took it, and 2 hours later, I got a phone call, and the client I was going to see kind of changed, and so I was going to stop. I wasn't going to stop initially, but then I decided to stop based upon this schedule change. And I thought, well, this will be really interesting because I just took this drug 2 hours ago, and now I'm pulling into a hotel at 11 o'clock at night.
Right.
I slept great. Well, I woke up and felt fantastic, and I never feel good in the morning, and finished my drive. And so I just think that when there's automobiles involved or dangerous activities involved in an individual who might be sleepy, I just think the drug really has virtually no downside. Headache, can cause some changes in birth control pills. I mean, it definitely has things that people should look into and educate themselves about. But when you're driving a car, doing something that you could potentially injure yourself or somebody else because of the state of your sleep, or you're a shift worker, or you're a patient with sleep apnea who continues to feel sleepy, these drugs are fantastic.
Yeah, cool. Well, very interesting. Is there anything else that you would like to circle back to and tell listeners? Again, every one of our listeners is somebody that occasionally sleeps, so anything you say is going to be relevant.
No, I think that, to me, I think a lot of sleep problems could be solved if people simply sort of established a wake-up time and really focused their mental energy on when they woke up and not so much on when you go to bed. So I always tell people, look, if you've got a set wake-up time, 7:30, then your bedtime should be a time when you're the earliest you're allowed to go to bed, not when you go to bed. So if you go to bed at 11 o'clock and get up at 7:30, that's your schedule. What that means is at 11 o'clock, if you feel sleepy, then by all means go to sleep. But if you don't feel sleepy, then stay up. Now, staying up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning doesn't give you license to sleep beyond 7:30. And so that's how you keep yourself honest. That's the reason why retirement or your kids leaving the house can really be devastating to some people's sleep, because with all that freedom, they really have a lot of difficulty sort of governing themselves. And so when it takes them a while to fall asleep and they get real panicky about that, they finally fall asleep at 4 o'clock in the morning, they sleep until noon, and then the problem really starts to pick up some traction.
Yeah,
so
they sort of lost the anchor.
Exactly, absolutely. So just keep your eye on your wake-up time and don't worry as much about your bedtime.
So thank you very much to Dr. Winter and to the Charlottesville Neurology and Sleep Medicine Center for sparing a bit of the doctor's time. Hopefully nobody drifted off and caught any sleep during that interview, because I think it was chock full of good stuff. Oh, and you know what? I want a public invitation. I'm going to throw this out there. If anybody listening either is or knows somebody who is doing a really extreme sort of alternative sleep schedule. In particular, I'm calling out the people that are doing the Uberman sleep schedule. I would love to have somebody on the show to talk about that. The Uberman sleep schedule is such a cool idea if it were real, but I find myself extremely dubious that anybody's pulling that off with good results. But if you are such a person, or if you know such a person, or if you know somebody who claims to be such a person, let me know. And now, as promised, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so I'm going to admit something here. We all know I'm a fan of science. This is essentially sort of a science podcast, but sometimes the things that scientists study are just, they seem a little bit obvious. So when I first read this study in the Psychological Science, which is a journal from the Association for Psychological Science, it seemed a little bit obvious. They were studying the parts of the brain that deal with reward centers and self-control. And lo and behold, they found that there is a correlation between the behavior of people that have respectively higher or lower levels of activity in these reward center areas and self-control areas when it comes to junk food. I mean, how can that not be the case? When you think about the basic biological rewards, I mean, the things that we tend to go after are food, sex, comfort, the things that have a very physical underpinning. So obviously attractive pictures of food and our brain's responses to those are probably going to have some bearing on our responses to actual attractive food that we come across out in the world. And that is what the study also showed. I guess the interesting thing is the extent of the magnitude. The people that had low activity in the area of the brain that was related to self-control, which is called the inferior frontal gyrus, were something like 8 times as likely to give in to their cravings for food that they knew they probably shouldn't eat, but were going to anyway, versus people that had stronger scores in their levels of self-control as judged by the activity of the inferior frontal gyrus. This was a study, by the way, that was based on 31 female participants whose brains were studied via fMRI scanning and then sort of pinged throughout the week on text message to ask how they were behaving out in the real world with regards to food stimulus and whether they were giving in to those attractive food stimuli or not. So in a way, while the study itself isn't that surprising, I think the magnitude of the difference, the low versus the high being 8.2 times different in the actual results and real world people's ability to control themselves, is pretty telling, pretty striking. And from a brain hacking perspective, it really did make me think about, okay, well, if they know that it's the strength or lack of strength of the activity in one particular region that's so strongly correlated with these real world behaviors, that seems like an ideal target for something like transcranial direct current stimulation. If people are really having a problem with controlling their eating behaviors, maybe just turning up the amperage a little bit on that brain region might be a really effective solution, maybe more so than getting a lap band or getting a liposuction or whatever it is people are doing these days. And obviously food behaviors are only one example of the kind of issues that people face when they're not dealing with their cravings in maybe the most helpful ways. Cessation of cigarette smoking or drugs, alcohol, things like that are all other examples, or things like gambling addiction. I mean, there's really a lot of different directions this kind of thing could go in. But anyway, we'll link to this article, and I think it's promising where this sorts of study could lead. You heard it. That is the episode. If you liked what you heard here, please recommend this podcast to your friends and leave us a review on iTunes. I do want to throw out an apology that it took a long time to get this episode out. I was doing some traveling, not an excuse. However, the next episode, episode 37, is already in the can. Interview already recorded, and it's going to be a really interesting one. It's a controversial episode where we're going to be talking about some controversial, not just controversial, but downright illegal substances. So prime yourself for having a strong opinion in the wake of upcoming episode number 37. The show notes for this show will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here, and I will be back at you next week on the same podcast and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smart podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smart should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.